The scorching Arizona sun beat down on Beckett Calloway's broad shoulders as he guided his dappled gray mare along the dusty trail, two large wooden barrels secured to either side of his saddle. The year was 1875, and like clockwork, the 30-year-old cowboy made his daily journey to Whispering Creek, the only reliable water source within 10 miles of the struggling settlement of Redemption. Beckett's weathered face, tanned from years under the merciless frontier sun, broke into a rare smile as he approached the bend in the trail that would reveal his true destination. It wasn't just water he sought each day, but a glimpse of the woman who had unknowingly captured his heart over the past 3 months. The first time he'd seen Beatrice Zimmerman tending her small garden outside the newly established doctor's office, Beckett had nearly fallen off his horse. She'd arrived in Redemption that spring, accompanying her physician father, who'd answered the town's desperate call for a medical professional. With her honey-blonde hair and determined spirit, she'd set about making the barren doctor's quarters into something resembling a home, despite the harsh conditions and the suspicious glances from townspeople unaccustomed to newcomers. As he rounded the bend, Beckett's heart sank. The familiar figure was absent from the small patch of struggling vegetables and herbs she nurtured with precious water carried bucket by bucket from the distant creek. Instead, an older man with a silver-streaked beard stood in the doorway of the modest building that served as both home and medical practice. "Morning, Dr. Zimmerman," Beckett called, tipping his hat respectfully. "Mr. Calloway," the doctor acknowledged with a nod. "Right on schedule, I see." Beckett dismounted, leading his horse closer. "Just bringing the day's water, sir. Is Miss Zimmerman?" He trailed off, suddenly conscious of how transparent his interest might appear. The doctor's tired eyes crinkled slightly. "My daughter's inside, tending to Mrs. Peterson. The baby came early this morning." Beckett nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Clara Peterson already had 4 children and had buried 2 more. Another difficult birth could prove fatal. "I'll just leave the water then," Beckett said, moving to untie the barrels. "She'll be sorry to have missed you," Dr. Zimmerman remarked casually, but the knowing look in his eyes made Beckett's neck flush hot above his bandana. As Beckett maneuvered the heavy barrels to the ground, the door creaked open. Beatrice emerged, wiping her hands on a blood-stained apron. Despite the evident exhaustion in her face, her eyes brightened momentarily upon seeing him. "Mr. Calloway," she said, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "You're a sight for sore eyes after the morning I've had." Miss Zimmerman, he replied, had already in his hands. "Everything all right with Mrs. Peterson?" "A healthy boy," Beatrice confirmed with a tired smile, though it was touch and go for a while. "Father says we couldn't have managed without your water these past months. The well at the Peterson homestead went dry last week." "Just doing my part," Beckett said modestly, though inwardly he glowed at her words. Dr. Zimmerman cleared his throat. "Beatrice, perhaps you might step outside for a moment. You've been cooped up since before dawn." She nodded gratefully and stepped into the morning sunlight, closing her eyes briefly as the warmth touched her face. Despite her plain calico dress and the dark circles under her eyes, Beckett thought she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever encountered. "How is your mother faring?" Beatrice asked, referencing the rheumatism that had kept Margaret Calloway increasingly confined to her rocking chair on the porch of their small ranch house. "Better some days than others," Beckett replied. "The liniment your father provided helps ease the worst of it." "I'm glad to hear it," she said sincerely. Then, with a slight blush coloring her cheeks, she added, "I look forward to your visits, you know. They're the most reliable part of each day." Before Beckett could respond, the doctor's voice called from inside. "Beatrice, Mrs. Peterson is asking for you." "I must go," she said apologetically. "But thank you, as always, for the water. It means more than you know." As she turned to leave, Beckett found his voice. "Miss Zimmerman, Beatrice," she paused, looking back at him expectantly. "Perhaps, when you have a free afternoon, you might permit me to show you Whispering Creek. It's quite beautiful this time of year." Her smile widened, transforming her tired face. "I'd like that very much, Mr. Calloway." "Beckett, please." "Beckett," she repeated, his name sounding like music on her lips. "Sunday after church, perhaps?" He nodded, suddenly feeling like a green boy rather than a man who'd spent over a decade breaking horses and driving cattle. "Sunday it is." As she disappeared back into the doctor's office, Beckett secured the empty barrels from the previous day's delivery to his saddle. He mounted his horse with a lightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the lesson load. The next 4 days passed with agonizing slowness for Beckett. Each morning, he made his journey to Whispering Creek, filled his barrels with the cool, clear water, and delivered them to the doctor's residence and office. Each day, his brief interactions with Beatrice sustained him through the long hours of ranch work that followed. On Sunday morning, Beckett arrived at the small white clapboard church earlier than usual, having spent an unprecedented amount of time ensuring his best shirt was properly pressed and his boots were polished to a shine. His mother had noticed his unusual attention to appearance and had merely smiled knowingly as she pinned a small wildflower to his lapel. "That Zimmerman girl is a fine young woman," she'd remarked. "Her father tells me she trained as a nurse back east before coming here." "Is that so?" Beckett had replied, feigning casual interest, though he hungered for every scrap of information about Beatrice. Now, as he sat in the hard wooden pew, he kept glancing toward the door, waiting for her arrival. When she finally entered alongside her father, Beckett nearly failed to recognize her. Gone was the practical, work-worn appearance he'd grown accustomed to. Instead, Beatrice wore a modest but becoming blue dress that matched her eyes perfectly, her hair arranged in an elegant knot at the nape of her neck. Throughout the service, Beckett found it impossible to concentrate on Reverend Wilson's sermon. His eyes continually drifted to Beatrice's profile, to the gentle curve of her neck, to the way she sang the hymns with quiet conviction. When the service concluded, Beckett waited by the church steps, hat in hand, stomach knotted with anticipation. Dr. Zimmerman approached first, nodding cordially. "My daughter tells me you're planning to show her Whispering Creek today," he said, his tone carrying a hint of fatherly concern. "Yes, sir," Beckett confirmed, "if that meets with your approval." The doctor studied him for a moment. "Beatrice is 23 years old, Mr. Calloway. She's quite capable of making her own decisions. But I appreciate your respect." He lowered his voice slightly. "She's had few opportunities for simple pleasures since we arrived here. This territory hasn't been kind to her dreams." Before Beckett could inquire further, Beatrice joined them, a small basket in hand. "I thought we might have a picnic," she explained, noting Beckett's questioning glance. "Nothing elaborate, just some bread and cheese." "That sounds perfect," Beckett replied, offering his arm. "My horse is hitched out front." Dr. Zimmerman watched them go, calling after them, "Be back before sunset, Beatrice." The ride to Whispering Creek took nearly an hour, with Beatrice seated sideways in front of Beckett, her body warm against his chest. The propriety of their position was questionable, but practical necessity outweighed convention in the frontier territories. "You ride well," Beckett observed as they traveled, noting how she moved naturally with the horse's gait. "My mother taught me as a child," she explained. "Before she passed. We lived in Pennsylvania then, near my grandparents' farm." "I'm sorry about your mother," Beckett said sincerely. "It was many years ago now," Beatrice replied. "Father and we've made our way together since I was 12. When he decided to answer the call for a doctor out here, I couldn't let him come alone." "Redemption is fortunate to have you both," Beckett said. "Before you arrived, the nearest doctor was in Tucson 2 days' ride away." "And yet, I sense not everyone welcomes our presence," Beatrice observed shrewdly. "Mrs. Sullivan still crosses the street when she sees me coming." Beckett chuckled. "Don't take it personally. Martha Sullivan is suspicious of anyone who can read books thicker than the Bible. Their conversation flowed easily as they rode, discovering shared interests and complementary differences. By the time they reached Whispering Creek, Beckett felt as though he'd known Beatrice for years rather than months. The creek itself was a revelation, a hidden oasis in the arid landscape, with cottonwood trees providing dappled shade and a gentle cascade of water creating the whispering sound that gave the place its name. Wildflowers dotted the banks, adding splashes of color to the scene. "Oh, Beckett," Beatrice breathed as he helped her dismount. "It's beautiful. I had no idea such a place existed so close to town." "Few people come here," he explained, tethering his horse to a low-hanging branch where it could graze on the lush grass. "Most use the North Fork for water, as it's closer to the main trail. This spot requires knowing the old Apache paths." "How did you discover it?" she asked, already spreading a small blanket in a sunny patch near the water's edge. Beckett hesitated, then decided on honesty. "An Apache man named Nilchi showed me when I was just a boy. He saved my life during a flash flood pulled me from the main creek just before the water swept through. Afterward, he brought me here, taught me how to find it again." Beatrice's eyes widened with interest. "You were friends with an Apache?" "More like reluctant teacher and stubborn student," Beckett admitted with a small smile. "I was 14 and thought I knew everything about this land. Nilchi showed me how little I actually understood." "What happened to him?" Beatrice asked, unpacking her modest picnic. Beckett's expression sobered. "The cavalry happened about 6 years ago. His band wasn't even hostile, but—" He shook his head. "That's not pleasant picnic conversation." Beatrice reached out, briefly touching his hand. "Life here isn't always pleasant, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't speak of it honestly." Her touch sent warmth spreading through Beckett's chest. "You're not like most women I've known, Beatrice Zimmerman." "I'll take that as a compliment," she replied with a small smile. They ate their simple meal beside the creek, talking of everything and nothing: Beckett's ranch and his hopes to expand his herd of cattle, Beatrice's training as a nurse in Philadelphia, their shared love of reading, though opportunities for new books were scarce in Redemption. "I have a confession," Beatrice said as they sat side by side, watching the water flow past. "I've often wondered why you personally bring us water each day. Surely a ranch hand could perform that task." Beckett felt heat rise in his face. "I suppose I could claim it's because I don't trust anyone else to select the cleanest water or to handle my mare properly on the rocky trail." "But those wouldn't be the true reasons," she prompted gently. "No," he admitted, gathering his courage to meet her gaze directly. "The truth is, from the first day I saw you planting that garden, I found a reason to look forward to each morning. Your smile when I arrived with the water, it became the highlight of my day." Beatrice's cheeks flushed pink, but she didn't look away. "I feared I was being too transparent in my own eagerness for your visits." "You were eager?" Beckett asked, hardly daring to believe his ears. "Embarrassingly so," she confessed with a soft laugh. "Father teases me mercilessly about how I find excuses to be outside when you're due to arrive." The revelation hung between them, sweet and fragile as a soap bubble. Then, moving with deliberate slowness, Beckett reached out and took her hand in his. Her fingers were slender but strong, a working woman's hands, despite her educated background. "Beatrice, I'm not a man of many words, but I want you to know that my feelings for you are sincere. I've never met anyone like you." She turned her hand in his, interlacing their fingers. "Nor I you, Beckett Calloway." The afternoon passed in a golden haze of conversation and companionable silences. They walked along the creek bank, Beckett pointing out various plants and their uses as taught to him by Nilchi. Beatrice listened with genuine interest, occasionally sharing her own knowledge of medicinal herbs learned during her nursing training. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they reluctantly packed up the remnants of their picnic. Before mounting the horse for their return journey, Beckett gathered a small bouquet of wildflowers growing near the water's edge. "For your garden," he explained, presenting them to Beatrice. "Though they pale in comparison to your beauty." She accepted them with a pleased smile. Now who's being transparent? The ride back to town was quieter, both lost in thought about the day they'd shared and what might come next. As they approached the doctor's residence, Beckett felt a sense of loss at the prospect of their time together ending. "When might I see you again?" he asked as he helped her dismount in front of her home. "Besides my regular water deliveries, I mean." "I'm free most Sunday afternoons," she replied, "and occasionally on Wednesday evenings after Father's surgery hours end." "Wednesday, then," Beckett said decisively. "Perhaps dinner at Widow Cooper's boarding house?" "The food's plain but hearty." "I'd like that very much," Beatrice replied, her eyes shining in the fading light. For a moment, they stood close, neither wanting to part. Then, gathering his courage, Beckett leaned forward and placed a gentle kiss on her cheek. "Until Wednesday," he murmured. "Until then," she whispered back, touching her fingers briefly to where his lips had been. As Beckett rode home in the gathering dusk, his heart felt fuller than it had in years. For the first time since his father's death had left him responsible for both his mother and their struggling ranch, he allowed himself to imagine a future brightened by something more than mere survival. Over the next few weeks, Beckett and Beatrice's courtship blossomed like desert flowers after a rare rainfall. Their Wednesday dinners at the boarding house became a regular fixture, as did their Sunday afternoon excursions to Whispering Creek. Each day, Beckett continued his water deliveries, but now they were accompanied by small tokens, a particularly beautiful stone he'd found, a book of poetry borrowed from Widow Cooper's small library, once even a length of blue ribbon that had reminded him of her eyes when he'd seen it in the general store. In turn, Beatrice began preparing special treats for his daily visits: fresh biscuits still warm from the oven, a jar of preserved peaches she'd traded her nursing services for, a knitted scarf when the autumn winds began to bring a chill to the mornings. Dr. Zimmerman observed their growing attachment with quiet approval, though he occasionally reminded them both of the practical challenges they faced. "A doctor's daughter and a rancher," he mused one evening when Beckett had stayed for supper. "You'll both need to adapt your expectations." "Father," Beatrice protested, embarrassed by his directness. "It's a fair point," Beckett acknowledged. "My ranch is small, the work never-ending, and the profits uncertain. It's not the life you were raised for, Beatrice." "And yet it's a life I could choose," she replied firmly. "Besides, my nursing skills wouldn't go to waste. From what I've observed, ranch hands are remarkably prone to injuries." The conversation had ended there, but it planted seeds of both hope and concern in Beckett's mind. He wanted nothing more than to court Beatrice properly, with marriage as the honorable conclusion, but he questioned whether he could provide her the life she deserved. These doubts were temporarily forgotten one crisp October morning when Beckett arrived with his water delivery to find the doctor's residence in a state of alarm. Dr. Zimmerman was frantically loading his medical bag, while a frantic rancher Beckett recognized as James Foster paced the porch. "What's happened?" Beckett asked, dismounting quickly. "Accident at Foster's sawmill," Dr. Zimmerman explained tersely. "Multiple injuries. I need Beatrice to come assist, but we have no transportation fast enough." "Take my horse," Beckett offered immediately. "She's the fastest mount in the county." "I can't ask that," the doctor began. "You're not asking, I'm offering," Beckett interrupted. "Besides, I'll come with you. 3 adults can fit if we ride carefully." Within minutes, they were on their way, with Dr. Zimmerman in front, Beatrice in the middle, and Beckett at the rear, controlling the horse. The sawmill was located 5 miles east of town, and they arrived to find chaos. A boiler had exploded, injuring 4 men with burns, lacerations, and in one case, a compound fracture of the leg. For the next several hours, Beckett watched in awe as Beatrice worked alongside her father, displaying a competence and compassion that only deepened his admiration. She moved from patient to patient, cleaning wounds, applying salves, administering laudanum when necessary, all while maintaining a calm demeanor that seemed to soothe the injured men. When the most critical work was done and the injured stabilized for transport back to town, Beatrice finally took a moment to rest, sinking onto a fallen log outside the damaged mill building. Her hands and apron were stained with blood, her face streaked with soot and perspiration. Beckett sat beside her, offering his canteen. "You were amazing in there," he said softly. She took a deep drink before responding. "This is what I was trained for. Back in Philadelphia, I assisted with far worse in the charity hospital." "Is that the life you miss?" Beckett asked, the old doubt resurfacing. "The city, the hospital work?" Beatrice considered his question seriously. "I miss certain aspects, the medical advancements, the libraries, the concerts. But I've found unexpected satisfactions here too." She looked at him directly. Connections that matter more than conveniences. The sincerity in her eyes banished Beckett's uncertainties. Taking her blood-stained hand in his, he spoke from his heart. "Beatrice Zimmerman, I love you. I think I've loved you since the first time I saw you tending that hopeless garden with such determination. I don't have much to offer beyond hard work and devotion, but if that's enough, I'd be honored to have you consider becoming my wife." For a moment, Beatrice's expression froze in surprise. Then, to Beckett's dismay, tears welled in her eyes. "I've upset you," he said, immediately contrite. "It's too soon." "No," she interrupted, squeezing his hand. "These are happy tears, Beckett. Yes, I'll marry you. My heart has been yours since you first smiled at me over those water barrels." Their joyful moment was interrupted by Dr. Zimmerman calling for Beatrice to help load the patients into wagons for transport back to town. As she rose to answer her father's summons, she leaned down and, throwing propriety to the wind, placed a swift kiss on Beckett's lips. "We'll speak more of this later," she promised, her eyes bright with happiness despite the grim circumstances surrounding them. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. News of their engagement spread quickly through Redemption, met with general approval and only a few raised eyebrows from the town's more conservative elements. Widow Cooper immediately offered to host a small celebration at her boarding house, while Margaret Calloway insisted on sewing Beatrice a proper wedding dress despite her arthritic hands. "I've been saving this fabric for years," Beckett's mother explained as she showed Beatrice the fine cream-colored cotton stored carefully in a cedar chest. "I always hoped to see my son married before I left this earth." "It's beautiful," Beatrice said sincerely, touched by the gesture. "But your hands, the pain must be considerable." Margaret waved away her concern. "Some things are worth a little suffering, my dear. Besides, it gives me great joy to welcome you to our family." While the women prepared for a December wedding, Beckett threw himself into improving the ranch house. He added a second bedroom, expanded the kitchen, and built a covered porch along the eastern side where the morning sun would make a pleasant spot for Beatrice to enjoy her coffee. "You're working yourself to exhaustion, Dr. Zimmerman observed one evening when he'd ridden out to check on Margaret's rheumatism. The house was perfectly adequate before. "Adequate for a bachelor and his ailing mother, perhaps," Beckett replied as he planed a board for new kitchen shelving. "But not for a wife, especially not one accustomed to finer surroundings." The doctor chuckled. "You underestimate my daughter's adaptability, son. But your efforts do you credit." November brought unexpected challenges when a harsh early winter storm swept through the territory, flooding Whispering Creek and making the trail treacherous. For 3 days, Beckett was unable to make his water deliveries, a fact that concerned him greatly given the town's dependence on his service. On the 4th day, determined to reach Redemption despite the conditions, Beckett set out before dawn. The journey was arduous, with mud sucking at his horse's hooves and fallen branches, blocking the familiar path. By the time he reached the creek, the sun was high overhead, and he was hours behind his usual schedule. To his dismay, the normally clear water was muddy and debris filled from the storm. He would need to ride upstream to find a section clean enough for drinking water. As he guided his tired mare along the swollen creek bank, a movement caught his eye, a flash of blue among the brush on the opposite shore. "Beatrice," he called, hardly believing his eyes as he recognized her familiar form. She looked up, relief washing over her face. "Beckett. Thank goodness you're all right." "What are you doing out here?" he demanded, immediately searching for a safe place to cross the turbulent water. "It's dangerous after the storm." "I was worried when you didn't arrive for 3 days," she explained. "Father said you were surely safe at your ranch, but I couldn't help thinking something might have happened on the trail." Beckett's heart swelled at her concern, even as his practical mind worried about her safety. "So, you decided to traverse flooded terrain alone?" "Beatrice, that was incredibly risky," says the man who rode out in the same conditions, she countered with a raised eyebrow. "Besides, I brought Ben Williams with me as an escort. He's checking another section of the creek upstream." Eventually finding a crossable section, Beckett made his way to her side of the creek. Once reunited, he couldn't resist pulling her into a fierce embrace, mud-spattered clothes and all. "I'm sorry I worried you," he murmured into her hair. "But knowing you cared enough to come looking, that means everything to me." They located Ben Williams, a teenage son of one of the local ranchers, and the three worked together to fill Beckett's water barrels from a relatively clear pool they discovered upstream. By the time they returned to Redemption, it was nearly dusk, but the town's relief at the restored water supply was palpable. "You two are quite the team already," Dr. Zimmerman remarked as they unloaded the precious water. "Though I'd prefer my daughter not risk pneumonia in the future. Once we're married, I'll ensure she stays warm and dry during storms," Beckett promised with a wink at Beatrice. "I wouldn't count on that," she retorted good-naturedly. "A doctor's daughter and nurse goes where she's needed, regardless of weather." Their wedding day dawned clear and cold on the second Sunday of December. The small church was decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons for the Christmas season, adding a festive air to the proceedings. Despite the frontier setting, Beatrice looked radiant in Margaret's lovingly sewn dress, a crown of dried wildflowers from Whispering Creek adorning her hair. Beckett, standing nervously at the altar in his one good suit, felt his breath catch as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm. The gathered townspeople, nearly every resident of Redemption, had turned out for the occasion, faded from his awareness, leaving only Beatrice and the incredible reality that she was choosing to join her life with his. Reverend Wilson's ceremony was brief but heartfelt, emphasizing the sacred bond of marriage and the particular challenges and joys of building a life together on the frontier. When it came time for their vows, Beckett had prepared his words carefully. "Beatrice, before you came to Redemption, I measured my days by tasks completed and cattle counted. Now I measure them by your smiles, your kindness, your courage. I promise to cherish every day we're granted together, to work tirelessly to give you the home you deserve, and to love you through whatever hardships or joys life brings our way." Beatrice's eyes shimmered with tears as she responded. "Beckett, you brought more than water to my door each day. You brought hope, laughter, and eventually love. I promise to stand beside you through drought and plenty, to create a home filled with warmth and care, and to love you completely for all our days." The celebration afterward at Widow Cooper's boarding house featured the best food the modest settlement could provide: venison stew, fresh bread, preserved fruits, and a small cake made with precious sugar saved for the occasion. Dancing followed, with a local rancher providing fiddle music that had even the most reserved townspeople tapping their feet. As evening fell, Beckett and Beatrice slipped away from the festivities, boarding the wagon that would take them to their ranch home, their home now. Margaret had arranged to stay with friends in town for a few days, giving the newlyweds privacy to begin their life together. Under a canopy of brilliant stars, they made the journey to the ranch, talking softly of the day's events and the future stretching before them. When they arrived, Beckett insisted on carrying Beatrice across the threshold, a tradition he'd heard about but never witnessed. "Welcome home, Mrs. Calloway," he said as he set her gently on her feet in the main room, where a fire had been carefully laid in the hearth by one of his ranch hands earlier that day. "Home," Beatrice repeated, looking around at the simple but comfortable space he'd worked so hard to improve for her. "It already feels right, being here with you." That night, as they discovered each other as husband and wife, Beckett marveled at how completely his life had transformed in the months since he'd first glimpsed Beatrice in her struggling garden. What had begun as a daily chore bringing water to the doctor's residence had blossomed into the greatest blessing of his life. Spring arrived early the following year, bringing with it the news that Beatrice was expecting their first child. The announcement delighted both Dr. Zimmerman and Margaret, who immediately began making plans and preparations despite the baby's arrival being months away. "I never thought I'd live to see grandchildren," Margaret confided to Beatrice as they worked together in the expanded garden Beckett had built behind the ranch house. "It gives me a reason to fight this old body's ailments a while longer." Beatrice, whose medical knowledge had already improved Margaret's comfort considerably, squeezed her mother-in-law's hand. "This child will know the love of both grandparents. I'm determined on that point." As Beatrice's pregnancy progressed, Beckett found himself making the journey to Whispering Creek with renewed purpose. The water was still needed, both for their household and for the medical practice in town, but now he selected special stones, feathers, and wildflowers during each trip, slowly creating a collection of natural treasures for his unborn child. "Our son or daughter will know this land as intimately as you do," Beatrice declared one evening as they sat on their eastern porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. "With a mother as determined as you, how could they not?" Beckett replied, placing his hand gently on her growing belly. Their daughter, Margaret Beatrice Calloway, arrived on a warm September night in 1876, with Dr. Zimmerman attending the birth and the elder Margaret providing support and encouragement throughout Beatrice's labor. When Beckett first held the tiny, red-faced infant with a shock of dark hair, he felt a love so overwhelming it nearly brought him to his knees. "She's perfect," he whispered, carefully returning the swaddled bundle to Beatrice's arms. "Just like her mother." "She has your eyes," Beatrice observed, studying the newborn's face with exhausted wonder. "And I suspect she'll have your determination as well." Life settled into new rhythms after little Maggie's birth. Beckett continued his daily water deliveries, but now he often had Beatrice and the baby accompanying him on the journey to Whispering Creek. As their daughter grew from infant to toddler, these family excursions became treasured rituals, with Maggie squealing in delight at the sight of the flowing water and the colorful wildflowers along its banks. By the time Maggie was 3, redemption had grown enough to justify the expense of digging a proper well in the town center, making Beckett's daily water deliveries unnecessary. Yet he still made regular trips to Whispering Creek, now collecting botanical specimens for Beatrice's expanding medical practice, which she operated alongside her father's until his peaceful passing in 1879. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Beckett brought Beatrice back to the very spot where he had proposed beside the sawmill. Now the area was transformed, with new buildings and equipment replacing those damaged in the explosion years earlier. "So much has changed," Beatrice observed, bouncing their second child, 2-year-old Benjamin, on her hip while Maggie explored nearby under her father's watchful eye. "Some things remain constant," Beckett replied, taking her free hand in his. "Like my love for you, which has only deepened with each passing day." "And my love for you," she responded, leaning against his shoulder. "Who would have thought that water barrels would lead to all this happiness?" "I knew the moment I saw your smile," Beckett said simply. That's why I rowed to the river each day, Beatrice. Not just for water, but for the chance to see that smile light up your face when I arrived. As the sun began its descent behind the distant mountains, casting long shadows across the land they both had come to love, Beckett and Beatrice gathered their children and headed home, their hearts as full as the water barrels that had first brought them together.